Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Northern Virginia at the conclusion of a Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies event with the chiefs of the Royal Air Force, Air Chief Marshal Sir Stephen Hillier, and the Chief of the United States Air Force, General David Goldfein, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Royal Air Force, the world's first independent Air Force, founded on April the 1st, 1918, by the consolidation of the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps. And joining us now is the historian of the Royal Air Force, Seb Cox, who is based at RAF Northolt, just in a London suburb where there are so many great airplanes, including the Queen's Flight, based out of that base. Sir, thanks very much for the time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So I want to ask you first, you're one of the busiest speakers now, given the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the RAF. Why is this, every centenary is important, but why is this centenary particularly important for the RAF?
Well, if you're the world's first independent Air Force, then reaching 100 years is quite an achievement, especially since at times the other services have done their very best to ensure that you didn't even reach your first decade, never mind your first 100 years. So it's a real milestone for the Air Force in a way that perhaps it's not so much a milestone for Royal Navies and armies reaching rather more centuries than 100.
Talk to us a little bit about the formation of the force. There was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, but it was something that was pushed through. It was organized during the war when both of the Naval Air Service as well as the Royal Flying Corps were in business, were fighting, participating, pioneering in their own ways. And then the decision was made that we need a consolidated independent Air Force. Talk to us about that time. What were the driving factors, at the very birth of the service when it was very much still in the crucible of what at the time was history's deadliest war?
Well, there were several factors, the most obvious of which was the Germans. It's all the Germans' fault, I'm afraid. The Germans bombed London in daylight in the summer of 1917, and this caused such a political storm, a media storm in the UK that the government simply had to be seen to do something. And so the Prime Minister appoints, interestingly enough, a South African General, Smuts, to investigate the organisation of the British Air Services. And Smuts was very influenced by a senior airman, Sir David Henderson. And Henderson it was who planted in Smuts's mind, I think, the seed of that in the future air forces were going to be able to operate independently from the actions of the surface forces, and that in order to utilize that capability properly, you needed to have airmen controlling these operations at the highest level and not simply soldiers and admirals who didn't necessarily understand the full capabilities of nascent capabilities, in this case of air power.
The RAF has had a history of innovation, right? First in founding an independent Air Force, and then also during the interwar years, we just heard Lord Trenchard sort of in 1919 already starting to look at the future, incorporating a role for the aircraft carrier, which people might have thought is counterintuitive because he saw that as just another place from which to operate air power. Talk to us a little bit about what the history of the RAF and innovation, and what you regard as sort of the seminal innovations throughout its history, whether it was pioneering air operations and transport operations. Talk to us a little bit about, from your standpoint as a historian, which were sort of the key elements where the RAF really sort of broke past molds, whether it was for projection of power or whether it was for projection of air influence through transport operations, etc.
Well, one of the earliest examples of innovation was when Lord Trenchard sent a squadron of aircraft to what was then British Somaliland, part of the empire, immediately after the war, to deal with a particularly difficult and potent Islamist insurrectionist. The British Army had said they would need 2 divisions of troops and that it would cost about £7 million at 1920 prices, and Trenchard said, well, we'll send a squadron of aircraft. It's important to realise that that squadron cooperated with some troops on the ground, but those were relatively restricted in numbers, so it became known as the cheapest war in history because it cost less than £100,000 as opposed to the 7 million that the army was quoting to mount the same operation. In terms of its success, it was immediately successful in a matter of weeks, and the squadron returned to the UK. It did one other thing while it was out there, which was for the first time an Air Force, I believe, utilised an aircraft specifically designed to be a casualty evacuation aircraft. So they adapted one of these DH-9 aircraft to take a stretcher on the back of the fuselage with a covering over it that closed over the casualty, and he could then be flown out of the combat zone, as it were. And that was the first time, I believe, that an aircraft had been specifically adapted. People had been carried out of combat zones on an ad hoc basis by aircraft before that, but this aircraft was specifically adapted to perform a CASEVAC role, first time in history.
Also, there were a huge number of power projection real-world examples, but also pioneering transport, if I recall correctly from my history.
Well, of course, the RAF was responsible for one of the first air evacuations in history out of, interesting enough, Kabul in Afghanistan in the mid-20s. There was significant political unrest and disturbance in Afghanistan due to the actions of the Afghan government at the time, and it was felt that the Westerners present in the city, mostly diplomats, but also diplomats' families, were in some danger, and the Royal Air Force mounted an evacuation of several hundred people from Kabul in the mid-1920s, and that's one of the first examples in history of using air powers to evacuate civilians and diplomats, in this case, who were in danger from, local troubles and conflict.
Let me take you to World War II. Everybody has a tendency of remembering the Dunkirk evacuation, obviously the Battle of Britain being one of the sort of core stories of the force. But let me ask you also about, as we heard from Sir Stephen, it wasn't necessarily about the fighter aircraft, but the extraordinary command and control networks that had been built in the interwar years, experimentation in radar, experimentation in ground control intercept. Talk to us about what people sometimes don't think of when they think of that heroic battle of the aviators in the sky, of which most of them were Hurricanes, actually, not Spitfires, right? The workhorse of that battle was the Hurricane. But about the thinking, the investment to create these command and control networks, recognizing that actually information was the greatest weapon. The fighter was just something that executed on that information.
Yeah. The great misconception, I think, is exactly as you state. People believe that somehow radar and the fighter aircraft, which are really the two opposite ends of the system, somehow these two made the crucial difference. Well, yes and no. The crucial difference was actually in the middle, because you had to link the radars. What you get from a radar is information on the threat, but you have to then assess the threat, decide how you're going to react, and dispatch the squadrons into the air at the right time, in the right place to make the interception. And what that system did was to tie radar using communications network. The great unsung heroes of the Battle of Britain are the telephone engineers. They laid telephone lines from every radar station in the UK into a centralised command and control node at Bentley Priory in London, where the head of Fighter Command, Dowding, and his staff could assess the information coming in from radar and from ground observers. It was then displayed on operations board and on operations tables in a format which the fighter controllers, one level down at the group level, could make determinations and decide their reaction, and they only had minutes to do it. A radar gave you about 20 minutes warning of a German raid over the Pas de Calais. It took about 4 minutes for the system to process that information before it appeared on an ops room table, but it takes 14 minutes for a Spitfire squadron in a battle climb to get to 20,000 feet. So that controller's got about 2 minutes to make his mind up. But without that essential communications element of networking the data in more modern terms, the radar itself is not the key. The Germans had radar in 1940, but they did not have a system akin to what we developed, what we would now call an integrated air defense system.
We were talking earlier about the movie Dunkirk, and it's spectacular. But to this day, there are British Army friends of mine who point out how the Air Force left them in a lurch on the beaches of Dunkirk. You know, they were nowhere to be seen. I just saw a documentary not very long ago where, you know, one of the troopers was saying, you know, those flyboys weren't even around. We were the ones who were stuck on the beaches. And then you see Darkest Hour, tremendous movie, but actually historically totally inaccurate given the incredible role of the French army, who was the vast numbers of which were not evacuated, who fought that final line to allow everybody to escape. From your standpoint, what are the biggest misnomers? So let's talk about Dunkirk, but also other sort of instances in RAF history where folks have sort of misunderstood what the service was doing and was actually engaged, or perhaps engaged differently than the public thought it was.
Well, you know, the British Army in 1940, many of the troops on the ground referred to the RAF as the Royal Absent Force. But that's simply because they couldn't see the Royal Air Force. But as you are well aware, if you're going to intercept an incoming raid before it hits the troops on the ground, it's best to do it before the troops on the ground can see them coming, because if they can see the bombers coming, then it's too late. And actually the Royal Air Force was mounting combat air patrols further inland that the troops on the beaches, fortunately for them, could not see, because they were intercepting the German aircraft coming into Dunkirk at a distance where those German aircraft could not drop their bombs and do damage to the people on the ground. It's as simple as that. And yes, you're quite right. Most of the perimeter, particularly later in the 9-day evacuation, the perimeter was being held by the French troops as the British gently withdrew onto the ships and came back to the UK. So, yeah, the great myth of the Royal Absent Force. Actually, at one point, one of the German Luftwaffe commanders actually records in his war diary that the Luftwaffe has lost control of the air over Dunkirk.
The RAF lost a large number of aircraft. Recently declassified records show that 200 aircraft were lost in that Dunkirk evacuation phase. Sortie generation rates, which were incredible, but you could also argue paved the way to prepare for the Battle of Britain that was started right after that campaign, with almost no pause in September 1940. There's a sense that it was an extremely close-run battle. From your standpoint as a historian, having seen all the records, classified and otherwise, how close-run an effort was that to stop the Germans?
One of the things that the Dunkirk evacuation did was it did show that there was a need to be tactically more flexible. Now, it takes a bit of time for that to filter right through an entire force of, 60 squadrons plus by the end of the battle. But there was some recognition that there need to be more flexibility in the tactical application in the air of the fighter aircraft. So that's one of the things. But it also, I think from the point of view of the aircrew, it showed them that their aircraft were perfectly capable of taking on the Germans, and that they were reasonably confident, in fact very confident, that they could match the Germans in the air. They had nothing to be frightened of. And if you compare that, for example, with the Polish campaign, where the poor Polish Air Force pilots are certainly trying to fight the Luftwaffe in aircraft that were markedly inferior in terms of quality, and I don't think the RAF pilots ever felt that during the Battle of Britain.
And but there's this perception of sort of this force fighting against all the odds and the massive German onslaught. And what you're saying is actually, if you go back and look at it historically, the deck was much better stacked in the British favor than folks might, want to believe in that sort of romantic image.
Yes, roughly speaking, talking in very rough terms, the equality in fighter numbers, for example, there was not an enormous numerical difference at the start of the battle between the numbers available to Fighter Command and the numbers available to the Luftwaffe, particularly of Spitfires and Hurricanes versus ME-109s. The Germans did have the advantage in that they could choose where and when they were going to attack. So the Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons certainly met superior numbers in the air, and in that sense the famous designation of them as the few is correct. But in terms of overall numbers, they were not as badly outnumbered overall, as is sometimes believed to be the case. And one of the crucial things about the battle actually was, and it is a battle of attrition, as the losses mount on each side, it's British industry was able to replace the losses of aircraft more or less throughout the battle, so that there was no point in the battle where the RAF was seriously concerned about running out of aircraft. This was not so much the case with the Luftwaffe, because their losses were not being consistently replaced by the German aircraft industry at the same rate as the British. There were only 2 days in the battle when the RAF did not have sufficient aircraft in what were called the aircraft storage units, the reserves of aircraft ready to issue. There were only 2 days where the losses exceeded the number immediately available in the aircraft storage units.
There are so many more questions I want to ask you, but at this point I think they're tearing down. Let me ask you 2 quick questions. One, talk to us about the relationship and the history of the RAF, and then what at the time was the Army Air Corps, then it became the Army Air Forces. The 2 services had a relationship dating back to World War I. Earlier than that, in terms of exchanges and dialogues among British and American airmen, that was sort of cast in World War II, solidified in World War II. Talk to us about that history between the 2 services and how each has helped the other over the past century.
Well, going back to World War I, the Royal Air Force, even in World War I, began to train pilots in the United States. They had been training them in Canada, but the weather factor in Canada, particularly in the winter, of course, was not ideal, as you can imagine. And so, as early as at World War I, we began to think about training pilots in the southern states of the United States precisely because of that weather factor, and that indeed took place. And that foreshadowed exactly what happens in the Second World War, where again you have British pilots training in Texas and other southern states before going back across the Atlantic Ocean to fight. And in both world wars, when America eventually enters the conflict, the American air services, whatever they might have been called at that precise point, were keen to capitalize on the Royal Air Force's experience of fighting in both of those conflicts. And famously, Tui Spats came over to Britain during the Battle of Britain, even before America was in the war, to try and understand what was happening in the UK and what the future held for a US Air Force if it was going to enter into that conflict. And once the Americans arrived, as it were, and were in the conflict, then they flew some combat missions with the RAF to get experience, and later on you have both Air Forces mounting operations in concert. You have Royal Air Force fighter aircraft escorting US bombers on some of those early raids into the European continent. So they not only drew on experience, but they literally operated together.
And of course, radar technology, right, with the Tizard Commission,
Yep.
made it to the United States. Jet engine from Sir Frank Whittle over here, where we produced it, and General Electric, obviously, in that relationship. Let me ask you, talk to us about what you think sort of the key lessons from the past 100 years of the RAF are, and what does that mean for the next 100 years of the service? Sir Stephen got that question. What's the RAF going to look like in 100 years? He invoked Churchill to counter-invoke Hap Arnold by General Goldfein, which was a nice moment. But talk to us. What are the key lessons over the past 100 years of the Royal Air Force? And where do you think the Royal Air Force, as your descendants 100 years hence will be sitting in this chair? What is the force that they're going to be looking at, do you think?
I think one of the key lessons from history is you have to be adaptable, and you have to be adaptable relatively quickly. You can prepare for certain conflicts. We prepared pretty well for the Second World War in terms of air defense. We were less well prepared, I think, in terms of air offense, both tactically but also strategically. Although the strategic theories were there, it took 2 to 3 years before you arrived at a situation where that strategic bomber force began to have any sort of significant effect. Not until roughly 1943 are you talking about an effective force, whereas fighter command had been effective from the very start, bomber command not so effective. So you do need to adapt, you do need to learn lessons in combat quickly, because you will learn that some of your preconceptions and assumptions prove to be wrong. But you have to have the flexibility to adapt as soon as you can to circumstances that you may not have foreseen. And air forces generally, because they tend to see themselves, and indeed usually are, at the cutting edge of technology, rather more than perhaps armies or navies, generally speaking they are pretty good at adapting, and I think the Royal Air Force has been pretty good at adapting over the years when it finds itself in situations that it might not previously have considered quite as carefully as one would like. Nobody is blessed with complete foresight 100% of the time with 100% accuracy.
And what do you think the force is going to look like in a century's time? Because Sir Stephen invoked Churchill and saying, what is it? You can't look that far. I should know the quote actually, but you can only look as far ahead as you can see, effectively.
Yeah. The honest answer is that I really don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. Nobody has any idea. But what I do think is that there will be some form of military force which operates in the third dimension and space. I cannot see that changing. It is so key to everything that we've known in the last century. And in the same way that armies and navies are still here in the 21st century as they were in the 16th century, I think there will be some sort of air and space force well into the next century, and as far as anybody's vision can see, there will be air forces.
Last question. So why is it that the Royal Air Force, which has historically been so good, but maybe not as good at executing, but certainly good at that intellectual visibility and thinking about space included, and yet the RAF never pursued space the way the U.S. Air Force did at several sort of key moments until, as we heard from Sir Stephen recently, sort of getting in the game with a satellite of its own. Talk to us, why has that been that resistance, reluctance, even though you've had theoreticians who've been thinking about space, conflict in space, operations in space throughout the whole time, including RAF officers who've been embedded with the U.S. Air Force for literally decades?
I think there are two principal reasons. One is the simple, old-fashioned budgetary limitations. Space was expensive. It's actually, in relative terms, I think, becoming cheaper. Unlike, in some senses, manned aircraft, space vehicles are becoming much, much cheaper, significantly cheaper. And so those budgetary constraints are starting to ease a little bit. The second reason, I think, to be perfectly honest, is that most of the senior Royal Air Force officers who make it to the highest rank are, funny old thing, they're pilots. And therefore, they have that slight institutional bias towards aircraft and air vehicles rather than space and space vehicles. But that is changing. There is a definite recognition in the Royal Air Force that we need to be in space. There was also, of course, if you like, on the intellectual side, there was an element which said, well, we can rely on the Americans, because the Americans are there, they can do it bigger and early on, certainly with the amount of resources you had, better than us, and therefore we can develop a relationship which allows us to exploit the USAF's space capabilities for our own purposes, and therefore, given the constraints we're operating under, that's the best way to go. We're now moving into an era where that's not so much the case. I don't mean that we won't cooperate, I mean that we now have a better ability to operate in space at a cost which is affordable for the UK.
And you are the historian of the RAF at an important time, but why is it that you think you've got the coolest job in the world? What powers you every day when you go in your office at Northolt?
Well, who wouldn't enjoy who wouldn't enjoy looking at 100 years of the history of this fantastic institution? I've enjoyed every minute of. I've now been the head of the historical branches. My office has been called for more than 20 years, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. Well, not quite every minute, but certainly every hour.
Sir, thanks so much again. Happy birthday to the Force, and look forward to asking you actually more penetrating questions in the future. There are so many dam buster questions, so many other things. Hopefully we can get together at the Royal International Air Tattoo and I'll find some more challenging questions to ask you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.